Welcome to this new lecture, set of 3 lectures that I'll be taking, looking at punishing borders, everyday bordering, and thirdly, how we might resist borders. I've outlined here the aims of the lecture, so looking at categorisation processes relating to migrants generally, but specifically to people in the asylum process. We'll be looking at some of the key concepts and debates around asylum migration and thinking about how policies might legitimise asylum seekers as a specific other, and all of which should help us to begin to think sociologically about asylum migration. A quick word about the teaching approach I'll be using, which is different to how you've been taught thus far in the course. The aim of this is to really provide I suppose, a transfer of knowledge before class. So you engage with material before class, and then we come to class and we discuss what you have read, what you have viewed together. And we'll do this the following way. There'll be some short recordings posted on Moodle that present some of the key ideas and concepts, with pauses integrated into the recordings to literally stop and go and undertake an activity. It might be to read an article, it might be to watch a short clip or listen to a podcast. There'll be some questions for you to reflect on and notes to take to bring to class that we can then discuss together. And we'll be interacting with these materials as you go through the recordings and again in class together. So it's going to be very much a collaborative learning space. So let's start with our first pause and reflection. And I want you to sit and think about, when we think about people in the asylum process, what they may be expected to look like and how they're expected to behave. How will we know if they really are refugees and asylum seekers, and what kind of checks do we use? Does everyone deserve sanctuary? When thinking about these questions, I'd like you to reflect on what you've covered in the course so far and think about the kinds of binaries that come to be produced and reproduced. Think about these in relation to power, and also how they are shaped by the contours of race, class, and gender. And looking at these images, these are images that emerged from newspaper reports after the UK agreed in 2017 to take in refugees from the Calais camp. And questions were asked about whether these were indeed refugees and whether they were the right kind of refugees. And I wonder why this was important. And I would like you to think about why you think that was important. Think about what kinds of people are entitled to welcome, and conversely, who is not welcome, who should be kept in and who should be kept out. And the framing of these kind of questions, not accidental, but of course by design, and largely by design in immigration policy. And we'll be exploring some of this in this lecture. So the making of the migrant, I think Bridget Anderson's work is a great place to start. And this quote where she talks about the making of the migrant that emerges through the links between immigration controls, racism, and ideas of autochthony and belonging is really helpful. She correctly sets out very clearly how UK immigration policy is founded upon a history of colonialism that has been key to the creation of the idea of race and the idea of whiteness at home and blackness abroad, and the creation of whiteness as a national identity. There is this legacy, we see it in the unravelling of Windrush, people who've been denied their Britishness and their free movement, their claims to British soil, which through immigration policy has rendered them as colonial subjects firstly, then citizens, then immigrants, then aliens. And Anderson talks about how immigration policy in the UK is actually raceful as opposed to being raceless. It is directly connected to racialised nationalities and preferences for some nationalities over others. We've seen this historically with immigration policy that favours migration from former colonies and old Commonwealth over new Commonwealth. Windrush is the embodiment of this, actually, this idea of blackness abroad and their incompatibility in relation to ideas of citizenship, nation and belonging. There's also this question of poverty, and controls that are designed to keep the poor out has a long history in the UK context, where we have toughened controls for some over others. For example, visa overstayers from high GDP countries are seen as less problematic and more likely to eventually return. Low GDP countries are more likely to be from the global south, and so consequently people from these areas come to be racialised and seen as problematic. And even though today immigration policy is carefully layered with anti-discrimination laws that are meant to correct for possible racist biases, by favouring migrants from particular nationalities or countries or states, and we look at the EU as an example, immigration policy implicitly favours white migrants, and those who are by extension unfavourable are non-white. And what I haven't mentioned here, but racialisation also occurs via media and public debates. A different story emerges in these narratives of references to floods, invasions, hordes, crime waves, invading, marauding, harbingers of disease, antisocial behaviour, and so on. Certain individuals come to be grouped and then collectively disparaged with reference to a combination of cultural, social, and or biological traits via such dehumanising language. So again, immigration policy comes to be imbued with discrimination that in itself reflects a kind of colonial narrative. The true Europeans have self-mastery and self-discipline as opposed to the lazy, uneducated and disorganised, usually colonised people. So these factors together come to define the migrant, and they have particular implications. They freeze the category of people into specific historical and social position. It locks a growing part of society into what is an alienating category, and it renders people stuck in this kind of liminal space. And of course, key problem is this lack of consistency in public debates. And part of that is linked to this problem of definitions, right? So what we have here are some definitions about who's a refugee, who's an asylum seeker, who might be a refused asylum seeker. Now, a refugee might be defined and protected in international law, and this tells us something about the international community's ability or duty to respond to their needs. Some argue this is an overly narrow definition and doesn't really reflect the reality of 21st century. People who are deemed categorised as asylum seekers are generally not welcomed in Fortress Europe in the same way that the elite are. They take great risks and are arguably the most vulnerable. But are often framed as having no voice and therefore easier to marginalise and easier to remove. People who are categorised as asylum seekers are often spoken generally as being young, fit, male, economic migrants in search of Western prosperity and a better standard of living. We tend not to talk about them as being young, elderly or sick. They flout the rules. They don't accept negative decisions, and they tend to remain. Again, this idea of being uncivilised, disorderly, not playing fair, not wanting to wait. And I'd like to pause here and look at this article by Walters on domopolitics, which I think is interesting. It's a useful concept in my view in thinking about xenophobia. It refers to this ideology that sees the state as a home, in contrast to a more classical liberalism metaphor of the economy as a household, and thereby setting up an opposition between the domestic and the international, encouraging a view of the state as a closed, secure space with guests by invitation only and doors locked at night. But it also has a second articulation, one where incomers have to be filtered, screened, controlled and domesticated. And this is rationalised as a series of necessary security measures in the name of a particular conception of home. And here we see this definition of migrants. Now, why does all this matter? Well, Anderson and Blind have done some work and looking at how the public focus on certain types of migrants. So asylum seekers, extended family members and low-skilled workers are often seen as those being illegal, whereas students and high-skilled workers are often counted in immigration statistics but of less of a public concern. So we can see how politics has a way of intervening in these debates. The conflation of refugee and migrants can have serious consequences for the lives and safeties of refugees, and blurring the two terms takes attention away from those specific legal protections that refugees require. And if you think back to Europe and the large numbers of people since 2015 who've been arriving on foot and on boats to Greece, Italy and elsewhere through the migrant trail, which are they? Are they refugees? Are they migrants? Are they both? Do we need to define them? And I'd like you to pause here and read Crawley and Skleperis' article and think about these questions around categorical fetishism, why we focus on definitions in this way. So I think important here to think of some of the key terms and concepts that inform debates around asylum migration. First is social exclusion and inclusion. Generally not applied to asylum seekers, but now they're more the focus of growing work on inclusion. But when individuals and groups suffer multiple disadvantages in various social sectors, they have this kind of cumulative exclusionary effect. And it is both formal and informal, right? So it happens in the public and private sphere. Integration is a problematic concept. There's no agreed definition. It relates to complex process of what any newcomer goes through to become part of a new society. But it requires the receiving society to do some work. In the UK and England, integration work happens on the point of positive decision, but not before. In Scotland, it's at the point of arrival. But this can be problematic for people in England and Wales if they have to wait a number of years for their positive decision on their asylum claim. The idea of belonging and affiliations at multiple geographical levels and linkages and networks and different ways to connect, it has to really move beyond these nationally based modes of thinking about belonging by birth or by soil. But it's a controversial concept and often appropriated by right-wing rhetoric and politics. Stephen Castles argues that we need to be cautious not to focus on the subjective over the structural dimensions of belonging. Identity, fundamentally about belonging and how people talk about belonging as they establish identities and experiences as they become part of UK society. But which identities we're able to hold on to, which ones we are forced to hold on to, and which ones that we can unveil of ourselves is another question. The idea of burden sharing is one that's used a lot in the rhetoric around asylum migration. It has a long history in the UK. It remains at the top of a political agenda. If you look at what's happening in Europe, sharing policy, sharing money, we're also talking about how we can share people. A burden is not something that's seen as desirable, but a problem that needs to be resolved. The application of dispersal policy has been one way to spread this burden. And the idea of liminality, of being someone kind of betwixt and between, who is not quite left there, but not yet fully allowed to be here. And I think this is quite a significant concept. We might not always talk about it as being occupying a liminal space, but there is something about a process of becoming, of not quite having arrived. And research that looks at people's experiences of the asylum process often talk about life in limbo, so much of this evolves around waiting. And finally, this idea of deserving and desiring. Austerity, I think, adds an interesting dimension to this discussion around deserving and desiring and understanding this question of domopolitics. Some commentators have explored this idea of austerity nostalgia, a kind of blitz spirit required to get us through tough times. But what is often implicit within austerity nostalgia is a mourning of the loss of a mythical social solidarity, which is based on shared ethnic and cultural homogeneity. The good old days, where people were like each other and lived in close-knit communities and knew their neighbours and shared the same cultural references. These narratives, of course, have long predated the financial crisis and is captured quite strongly in Paul Gilroy's work on post-colonial melancholia. But it is a narrative that's becoming increasingly common, particularly in the context of migration. There are too many of them. They're not like us. They're a threat. They're taking our resources, our symbolic and our material resources. So these are some of the key ideas when we think about asylum migration. And I'd like you to pause here and read one of these articles. So just select anyone, but reflect on the following questions and write down your notes and bring them to class to discuss. And in the article, think about what are the dominant concepts? Are they the ones I just mentioned? Are there other ones that emerge? What do they reveal about this idea of categorical fetishism? And what do they reveal, if anything, about the ways in which discourses and policies work to perpetuate this otherness of asylum-seeking people as a specific category of migrant? I'm going to pause there at the end of this recording. Okay, moving on to the second part of this recording, and we're going to be looking at this question of policy and the creation of legitimacy in relation to people seeking asylum. And this follows on from some of the material covered in Gareth's lectures. So really what we're looking at are incremental legislative changes that have changed the way in which people seeking asylum are absorbed into mainstream society. And qualitatively speaking, this is a new environment for asylum seekers and refugees, whilst there are some continuities and some differences. As Gareth's lectures will have pointed out, these kind of ad hoc arrangements of the past have been replaced by a more formal programme of arguably segregation and separation that doesn't seek to promote any kind of inclusion. Indeed, the kind of settlement patterns that are imposed on people are extremely tightly controlled. And policy and media attention contributes to portraying asylum seekers as a separate group requiring separate types of solutions. And people who are in the asylum process encounter a range of measures and policy mechanisms that are designed with an overarching policy framework of deterrence. And this is really manifest from 1990s onwards. Liz Ficchetti argues that part of this focus of deterrence means it also becomes about numbers, how many can be absorbed into Europe. But she questions how asylum claims can be assessed objectively if the focus is on numbers and quota and not on need, contrary to a humanitarian approach which advocates one focused on need and not numbers. Deterrence mechanisms are controversial, permission to work is denied, withdrawal of in-country support if a claim is not made as soon as is reasonably practicable, and there are increased levels of destitution amongst people seeking asylum. Is this what Gibney and Horson describe as a noble lie? So the use of these types of mechanisms, they contribute to this idea of a myth perpetuated by the elite to ensure some kind of social harmony, to show that something is being done. Perhaps, but these are also arguably decoy policies because as the focus on the most controversial aspects are challenged, other aspects pass unchallenged. And an example of this is in 2015, around the time of the groundswell of refugee solidarity in the face of what was happening in Europe. At the very same time, Immigration Act 2016 passed through Parliament in the UK. So I'd like you to pause and reflect on these questions and think about what links we might make to Gareth's lectures on policy and legislation and how policy and legislation create legitimacy in relation to migration. So let's look at some of those tools of immigration policy. The first is dispersal. When it comes to welfare support for asylum seekers, housing and subsistence, there is arguably an element of choice. Asylum seekers may opt out and be supported by family and friends. But dispersal is the only means of obtaining accommodation if there are no family or friends and if one is destitute. So in fact, it removes a freedom to choose where you would like to live. There is no real choice here. It removes them from kinship and social networks, contributing to marginalisation and longer-term exclusion. Dispersal itself is an accommodation-led policy driven by availability of housing, not by need, and has been substantial profiteering for the private housing market. It has also driven further privatisation of services, including the busing of dispersed asylum seekers to sites of dispersal, housing providers, private interpreting services, lawyers, and so forth. Local authorities could opt in to become dispersal neighbourhoods, and this contributes to a remaking or a remapping of the social geography of certain neighbourhoods, and I'll come back to this point. The logic of dispersal is that it's kind of twofold rationale. One, to relieve pressure on the southeast of England, and the second is that the processing will be so fast and firm that there's no need for individuals to tap into existing social ties. Of course, the reality is something different, and this is going to have some kind of effect on belonging, because the arrival of a diversity of new migrants in dispersal neighbourhoods, and this is where we enter into the area of sociological inquiry into the social geography of dispersal itself. The arrival of people in numbers, particularly in predominantly white housing estates, did at the time, in the early 2000s, raise concerns about cultural compatibility, in inverted commas, and fears of encapsulated migrant communities, and a society fractured by the existence of parallel lives, following Cantwell. Debates that echoed the British race relations agenda of the 1970s and 80s. Dispersal also fuels a type of NIMBYism, a not in my backyard narrative that legitimizes hostility and reinforces undesirability in public consciousness. They, in inverted commas, are a threat understood in a variety of ways through discourses of difference, ambivalence, entitlement, and eligibility. They drain resources, they become a burden, they become a pressure, so there's a kind of parasitic discourse that emerges. And as a result, hierarchies also pop up all over the place based on the route in, whether they are through quota refugees, through the Gateway Protection Programme, through the Syrian Vulnerable Persons Resettlement Scheme, or through dispersal. Welfare, well, welfare relates not just to housing, but also how people are supported, subsistence, and the exclusionary policies outlined under dispersal that segregate and degrade also contribute to legitimised hostility. There's a separate welfare support system that removes people in the asylum process from mainstream welfare services. An important myth surrounding asylum migration has been and continues to be that asylum seekers are really economic migrants in disguise, chasing economic betterment by accessing provisions of British welfare state. And the setting up of a segregated system supported this. But in relation to welfare support, asylum seekers are excluded from the market and cannot claim mainstream benefits, and have been supported by vouchers and cash, then vouchers reintroduced, then a cashless credit card. All of this is meant to enable UKBE to cut down on the abuse of asylum support and provide a more efficient system, quote unquote. But actually, this is a very expensive system. And the new Immigration Act itself merits a little bit more attention here, cutting financial and accommodation support for people who are refused asylum, curtailing the scope of support as well. More generally, these measures introduced in the new Act also reclassifies refused asylum seekers in a way that's very problematic. And so what we have is the use of destitution and detention as even more forcible tools for deterrence. And the present context in the UK has gone further to exclude asylum seekers over any other category of migrant. Not only has immigration policy in the UK forced people into destitution, but has now forced people with children into destitution. So we're taking steps further and further in a more aggressive set of politics. So I'd like you to just focus on some of these study questions at this point and pause. And take notes and answer why we think this is important to understand better and what is specific about asylum migration, given the different regimes that people are subject to. Can we do without them when trying to understand sociologically the experience of asylum, and think through the reading and discussions thus far what hierarchies emerge and why they might be important sociologically. Turning now to detention. Well, detention has been used historically in the UK. Firstly, detention from terrorist threats, i.e. somebody on suspicion of terrorist activities, and detention during wartime for controlling so-called alien enemies. And detention has become a rising form of enforcement in the immigration legislation in the UK. Only EU state is the only EU state where people are detained without any time limit. And it's now becoming increasingly widespread across Europe. The rationale in the UK is that it only occurs at the end of the process, but there are people who are detained upon arrival or who are released because they cannot be removed, and it's a huge financial cost. Right? And here's some figures that demonstrate the extent of money that's paid in compensation following unlawful detention. But it's also a huge human cost. And I'd like you to pause here, and there's two things I'd like you to do. First of all, listen to this recording. And it's Holly and Michael's story about the effects and experience of detention on their relationship. And I'd also like you to watch Behind the Wire, which is a documentary about life in Dungavel, which is Scotland's only immigration detention centre. And I'd like you to reflect on some of those key messages in light of the debates covered thus far. Finally, looking in terms of tools and mechanisms, looking at deportation, or more generally understood as the capacity of a state to exercise its border control. This is fundamental to liberal democracy. It is fundamental to the sovereignty of the state, its capacity to control borders. But although policy in a liberal democracy must in some measure reflect the preference of its citizens, nowhere does a majority of the citizenry support open borders. And immigration control implies two capacities: one, to block the entry of individuals to a state, and to secure the return of those who have entered. And deportation is a specific form of exclusion from the territory of the state, but it's become very much normal part of the asylum regime. There are a number of constraints in terms of how it is implemented. Cost is one of them. It costs a lot of money. Non-refoulement is a principle of international law that prohibits the expulsion, deportation or return where there is a risk of life or freedom that should be threatened, and is widely regarded as one of the key principles of refugee and immigration law. And given the constraints and given its unpopularity, it is something of a mystery that states bother at all. But arguably, maintaining policies on deportation, the state furthers this myth, this noble lie that something is being done, knowingly told by the elite to maintain a social harmony. And arguably, it serves a kind of threefold purpose. It assuages public opinion, which would not calmly view the state's incapacity in this area, right? So the public has to believe the state is doing something. It serves as an, albeit unquantifiable, disincentive, arguably. And in cases where a policy of voluntary return is operated, as it was on a massive scale in Germany in the late 1990s, for Bosnian and Kosovan asylum seekers granted temporary protection, it allows the state to apply pressure in favour of return. So holding out the prospect of possible, however remote, deportation allowed Germany to increase the incentives for migrants to return under favourable voluntary conditions. But it's also reflective of what we could describe as unsafe passage, and there's a tremendous human cost involved. And here we'll focus on the case of Jim Mbenga, who on October 2010 was detained pending deportation at Brooke House at Gatwick Airport, and who died as a result of being restrained in a chokehold on a forced return flight. 3 G4S guards were accused of killing him by forcibly pushing his head down and restricting his breathing. His last words were, "You are killing me, I can't breathe." And by the time cabin crew got to him, it was too late. And this took 35 minutes from him being taken on the flight to his death. The guards involved were cleared of his manslaughter, and the defence was that Jimmy Mbenga was a large man, heavy, powerful and obstructive. But the case is further complicated by the discovery of what could only be described as extremely racist and highly offensive text on the mobile phones of 2 of the 3 men, particularly in relation to personal views of immigrants. 70 plus racist texts on 2 of their phones. These texts were ruled inadmissible by the Old Bailey judge, as they might prejudice the case. So the jury were not to know of any of this, or about the coroner's report, which identified a culture of racism within G4S that was an accepted fact of life for detainees. And what this does is it shows how detainees and deportees are depersonalised, right? They're dehumanised by those very institutions and systems and processes that monitor and surveil and manage their movement. Following the acquittal, the judge told the jury they were not to be concerned if they later read about material that was ruled inadmissible, like this text that we can see on the screen. And I think this makes us ask a question about what we are to make of this judge's advice. And it raises an important question woven into the making of The Migrant. The context was missing. Is it possible to separate out the relationships of power between guards and prisoners, the racism underpinning immigration controls, and how do we question where there will be fair treatment of certain migrants in this context? And the concept of the migrant has in fact very different legal, social, gendered and economic connotations, which generate different levels of marginality, vulnerability, visibility amongst immigrants generally, and can be understood, I think, in terms of hierarchies and scales. Some belong more than others, some are entitled more than others, some deserve more than others, some are more desirable than others, and so forth. These hierarchies are important because they reveal in themselves inequalities that emerge from how certain people are categorised, imagined, cast, constructed and defined. And we also need to acknowledge that immigration regimes, as well as media, politics and everyday discourses, contribute to the building and prop up these hierarchies and scales. So we can see why Bridget Anderson says migration, the migrant, is a difficult word. Who is the migrant is often so unclear in public and policy debates. The way that certain people are imagined reveals the nature of power in social relationships. So asking the question, who is a migrant and what kind of migrant, I think helps us unpack some of those inequalities and gives us some tools to think more sociologically about definitions and categorizations. Is there anything sociologically and politically specific about asylum migration? Well, I would say that there is, that from kind of mid-90s onwards, what we have are, through increasing requirements of employers to check immigration status and other internal immigration controls, everyday bordering has become an everyday phenomenon at points of accessing services and other benefits. So what we see is a major shift from a culture of service to a culture of suspicion by service providers, benefits agencies, social services, employers, education. It contributes to this idea of this culture of disbelief that becomes shorthand for a relationship between the Home Office and people in the asylum process, which translates into a culture of denial, deport now, appeal later, which then becomes the culture of fear. Remember the go-home vans? And this takes us into the ways in which we become complicit, and ways in which we collude. I'd like you to pause and watch this clip and reflect on the following questions, and think about bring your notes to class and think about how this translates for different people with different experiences. So to summarise, we've looked at what is specific about asylum migration, problematic conceptualisations, and the way in which policy creates borders, and ways in which immigration policy is used as a tool to control and manage immigration and diversity. And this takes us into next week's class, which will be looking at everyday bordering practices. Thank you.